Chapter 3. Susanoo in Izumo, the Serpent and the Sword. Part 1. The Land of Izumo. A God among Mortals. Izumo is one of the oldest named regions in Japan, a province along the Sea of Japan coast in what is now Shimane Prefecture. Even by the time the Kojiki was compiled in the early 8th century, Izumo had a distinct mythological identity. It was the land of Susanoo, the land of his descendants, the land of Okuninushi, the great deity who would eventually rule the entirety of the earth before surrendering it to the heavenly gods. Izumo is, in the geography of Japanese mythology, the counterpoint to heaven, the earthly realm, rich and ancient and complex, with its own traditions and its own claims on the divine. Susanoo arrived there stripped of his heavenly privileges, beard cut, nails pulled, diminished by punishment and exile. He was still a god, still more than mortal, but he was a god without a domain, without a role, without a purpose. He had spent his divine existence in grief over a mother he'd never met, in rage over a kingdom he didn't want, in destruction that had gained him nothing. He was, in the most literal sense, lost. He walked until he reached the headwaters of the high river, the Fire River, in the mountains of Izumo. And there, floating downstream on the current, he saw a pair of chopsticks, wooden, ordinary, completely unremarkable. And yet, to someone with divine perception, to someone who understood what the presence of chopsticks implied, completely extraordinary. Chopsticks mean a meal. A meal means a household. A household means people. He followed the river upstream. The family at the river. He found them at the bend of the river, a man named Ashinazuchi, a woman named Tenazuchi, and between them a young woman of striking beauty named Kushinadahime. All three were weeping, but it was the particular weeping of people who have wept so long that the tears are almost automatic now. Not fresh grief, but grief worn into the body like a groove. Susanoo approached and asked the simple question, "Why?" The old man's answer came slowly, as if each word cost him something. He had been, past tense, the father of 8 daughters. They had been a family of 10. And every year, in the autumn, a great serpent came down from the mountains. Every year it took 1 daughter. This had been happening for 7 years. 7 daughters were gone, only Kushinadahime remained. And tonight is the night, the old man said. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The family was not praying for a miracle. They were simply sitting with the fact of what was coming, because they had learned that miracles did not come for them. They had prayed, presumably, for the 7 daughters before this one, and each time autumn came, and the serpent came with it, and another daughter was gone. They were doing the only thing left, being together, being present for what could not be prevented. Susanoo listened to all of this. Something in him was still. The man who had wept enough to wither mountains understood something about this family's grief that perhaps no other god in heaven could have understood. He had lost a mother. They had lost 7 daughters. There is a point at which grief becomes so large that it is simply the climate you live in, and he recognized that climate in them. He said, "I will kill the serpent, but you must give me Kushinadahime as my wife." The old couple stared at this stranger, this wandering god with a military bearing and grief behind his eyes. There was no reason to trust him. There was also nothing left to lose. Susanoo told them who he was. Susanoo no Mikoto, brother of Amaterasu, son of Izanagi, a god exiled, but still divine. And the old couple believed him, or believed in the impossibility of the alternative, and agreed. Part 2. Yamata no Orochi, the monster, an ancient force of nature. We should talk about what Yamata no Orochi actually is. The name means eight-branched great serpent. Ya for eight, mata for branch or fork, Orochi for great serpent. But the numbers here are not literal. In ancient Japanese, 8 was a number that meant vast, uncountable beyond ordinary measure. 8 valleys, 8 hills, 8 heads, 8 tails. What the myth is describing is a serpent so enormous that it constitutes a landscape. Its body stretched across multiple mountains simultaneously. Forests grew on its back. Its belly was perpetually red and inflamed, as if something inside it was always burning. What was Yamata no Orochi? There are different ways to read the myth. At the most literal level, it is a monster, a supernatural predator that had established dominance over a region through its annual harvest of human life. At a mythological level, it may represent the kind of recurring natural disaster, flood, perhaps, the high river overflowing catastrophically each autumn, that ancient people understood as a divine or demonic force. There is good reason to think the Orochi story is associated with flooding. The high river, the fire river, runs through the Izumo region and historically flooded severely in the autumn. The serpent comes every autumn. Its blood, when Susanoo kills it, turns the river red. The name of the river itself, High Fire, may encode an ancient cultural memory of something violent and consuming that came seasonally. The serpent may be the flood, given form and face, and the kind of narrative logic that makes catastrophe comprehensible. World Mythology. The association of serpents with rivers and floods is nearly universal in world mythology. The Mesopotamian Tiamat is a sea dragon associated with chaos and primordial water. The Egyptian Apophis is the serpent of chaos that threatens to swallow the sun. The Chinese dragon is inextricably connected to rivers, rain, and the control of water. The Greek Typhon is a serpent monster associated with devastating storms. In almost every case, the serpent is the force that cannot be controlled, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be appeased, only defeated. Susanoo's encounter with the Orochi places him squarely in this universal mythological tradition of the hero who brings the uncontrollable under control. Whatever its original referent, in the myth as we have it, Yamata no Orochi is exactly what it appears to be. A monster, enormous, ancient, hungry, powerful, and cunning. The sake trap, intelligence over force. Susanoo's strategy was, at its core, disarmingly simple. He would not fight the Orochi in direct combat, not with a sword against 8 heads, not in the darkness of an autumn night on unfamiliar ground. He would use the serpent's own appetites against it. He transformed Kushinadahime into a fine tooth comb, the kind used to dress hair, and placed her in his own hair for safekeeping. This is one of those mythological details that seems almost comically impractical until you understand what it means symbolically. The beloved is carried within the self of the protector. She is not hidden away at a distance. She is part of him, carried with him, inseparable from him in the moment of danger. It is an image of intimacy so complete that the boundary between self and beloved dissolves. Then he gave his instructions to Ashinazuchi and Tenazuchi. Build a fence with 8 gates. At each gate, build a platform. On each platform, place a large vat. Fill each vat with sake, but not ordinary sake. brew it 8 times. 8 separate fermentations, each one starting from the product of the last, producing a drink of extraordinary potency, a sake so strong that ordinary human senses couldn't hold it, a sake that would reduce the divine to helplessness. Then wait. The night came. The mountains trembled. The river darkened. The air filled with the presence of something immense. And then 8 heads appeared above the tree line. 8 pairs of burning red eyes catching the firelight. 8 long necks swaying as they moved down the mountainside toward the valley that had fed them for 7 years. And then the heads caught the smell of the sake. 8 times brewed sake, the vapors of it rising in the autumn air, warm and sweet and impossibly inviting. The Yamata no Orochi, this ancient force of nature, this creature of valleys and mountains and centuries of unchallenged dominance, stopped, 8 heads swaying, tasting the air. Then, one by one, each enormous head lowered itself over one of the 8 vats and began to drink. The Orochi drank. The divine sake was unlike anything it had tasted in its long existence. Warmth spread through each of its 8 heads. The burning in its belly that was always there became a different kind of warmth. Not hunger, but satiation. Not violence, but ease. The red eyes clouded. The vast body, stretched across the valleys of Izumo, began to relax, to settle, to slow. And Yamata no Orochi, terror of the Izumo region, annual devourer of daughters, fell asleep. All 8 heads at once. The monster slept. The battle and the hidden sword Susanoo did not wait. He drew his sword, the Totsuka no Tsurugi that he had carried since heaven, and began. Head after head, tail after tail, the great serpentine body, stretched across 8 valleys, came apart under his blade. The blood ran into the high river and turned it red, and people still say, looking at the high river today, that the water carries a reddish tint from the blood of the Orochi that Susanoo spilled there in the age of the gods. He worked his way through the creature methodically, section by section, from the heads through the body toward the tails. 8 heads, 8 tails. The math was simple, the execution was not. This was not fighting a monster in the darkness and hoping for the best. This was a controlled operation, conducted against a sleeping target, still requiring a god's strength and precision to accomplish. And then he reached one of the middle tails. The text specifies the middle tail, though a creature with 8 tails has no single middle, and his sword struck something hard. The blade rang, not the sound of flesh or bone, but of metal against something harder than metal. The edge notched, chipped, as if it had struck stone. Susanoo stopped. He cut more carefully, pulling back the scales and the muscle of the tail, cutting through it slowly, section by section, with the concentrated attention of someone who has found something unexpected in exactly the place where nothing should be. And inside the tail, wrapped and protected within the body of the serpent as if it had always been there, as if the monster had been its sheath for all the centuries of its existence, was a sword. It was unlike any sword Susanoo had ever seen. The quality was beyond what mortal smiths could produce, beyond what even divine smiths typically achieved. It had a presence, a weight and a luminosity that suggested something more than excellent craftsmanship. It was a sword that had been in the world for a very long time, that had carried with it the accumulated power of its waiting. Susanoo held it with reverence. He understood, with the instinct of a divine being encountering something that operates at a different register than the ordinary, that this was not a sword he should keep. It was not his to claim. It needed to go to Amaterasu, both as a gift and as an acknowledgment, a brother's gesture of reconciliation after the catastrophe he had caused. Scholars note: the sword found in the Orochi's tale has several names in different texts. Futsu Mitama in some accounts, Ame no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the sword of the gathering clouds of heaven, in others. It would later be renamed Kusanagi no Tsurugi, the grass-cutting sword, in the adventures of Yamato Takeru. It is one of the 3 imperial treasures of Japan, said today to reside at Atsuta Shrine in Nagoya, where it has been kept for over 2,000 years. Like the mirror at Ise, it has never been publicly displayed. Its precise form is unknown even to the priests who tend it. Part 3. Susanoo Reborn, the poet of Izumo. He retrieved Kushinadahime from the comb in his hair, transforming her back into her true form. He looked at her. She looked at him. The monster was dead. Her family was safe. The high river was already carrying the last of the Orochi's blood toward the sea. And the god who had come from nowhere and kept his promise stood before her with a legendary sword in one hand and, perhaps for the first time in his divine existence, nowhere particular to be and nothing urgent to destroy. They were married, and in the act of settling into this new life, in the searching for a place to build their home, in the looking around at the landscape of Izumo with fresh eyes, something extraordinary happened. Susanoo was moved to poetry, the storm god, the weeper of world-withering grief, the destroyer of sacred paddies and holy halls, the exile from heaven. This god looked around at the clouds rising over the mountains of Izumo, felt what it was to have arrived somewhere, truly arrived, for the first time, and composed a poem. 8 clouds arise, he said. 8 clouds rising over the mountains of Izumo. And I build an 8-fold fence of clouds, this many-layered fence, to shelter my young bride within it. Oh, what a many-layered fence! The poem is called the 8 Rising Clouds Poem, Yakumo Tatsu, and scholars consider it the first waka poem in Japanese history, the form of Japanese poetry that would eventually produce some of the greatest literature in any language. The tanka, the renga, the haiku, traces its ancestry back to this storm god, standing in a new landscape, overwhelmed by a feeling he had no word for yet, and arranging 31 syllables in a way that made the feeling visible. Think about what that means. The first poem in Japanese literary history was not composed by a court poet, not by a priest, not by an emperor. It was composed by a god who had spent his divine existence in grief and destruction, who had been punished and exiled and diminished, who had arrived at the bottom of everything, and then found at the bottom something worth building a fence to protect. World Mythology. This transformation of Susanoo from destructive grief to protective creativity is one of the most psychologically sophisticated elements of Japanese mythology. It maps onto what contemporary grief researchers call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon whereby severe loss, if survived and metabolized, sometimes produces not just recovery, but genuine transformation, new capacities, new perspectives, new creativity. Susanoo does not simply recover from his grief. He is transformed by it. The energy that had gone into world-withering mourning becomes, in Izumo, the energy of poetry and protection. He settled in Izumo. He and Kushinadahime had descendants who became the great deities of the Izumo tradition, a lineage that runs through Okuninushi, one of the most important kami in the Shinto tradition, who would eventually rule the earth itself. Susanoo's exile, which had seemed like the end of everything, had become the seed of an entire mythological dynasty. The storm god was home,